we had an agreement that we would only talk to guests that at least interests one of us a lot. And today's guest, Josh Lee, I'm very interested in because he is a fantasy football analyst and just generally obsessed with fantasy football. And so am I. So I love that. And yesterday, I was explaining fantasy football to you, something that you've never really heard of or dabbled in. And I saw that you got a little interested too. So I'm just curious what piqued your interest so far.
I think the most important thing I found is like how real life player performance and fantasy performance of the same players kind of merge together. And there is just so much maths goes on behind what a player is expected to do. There is just so many different parameters that are at play, which I found like very fascinating compared to, let's say, a scenario where you're not considering so many parameters in play. Also, like I found like so much similarity between investing in stocks and mutual funds, which is something I used to do at Goldman. And there is just so many similarities between how you're trying to invest in stocks that are hard to find, that the normal market doesn't know. And when you were kind of explaining the first 4 rounds of the draft, you pick up the obvious players, but where fantasy football becomes like really interesting is the remaining 7, 8, 9 players that you pick in the team, where you have to really know and you should have done your research.
And yesterday, when I was explaining you all the minute details about fantasy football, it wasn't making a lot of sense. But then when both of our light bulbs clicked, we realized, oh, it's like the stock market, like you just said. And just like the stock market, you fail a lot. I guess the big difference is that when you lose in the stock market, it can really affect your life. And in fantasy football, hurts for a day, but it's all the benefits of stock trading and none of the bad stuff.
Sounds like the perfect thing to be doing.
Exactly. And before Josh hops on, so talking to a fantasy football analyst for me is perfect for the show just because it marries my interest in data and analytics and data science and fantasy football. What type of guests in the future would really interest you?
I think I always find it interesting talking to people who are doing non-intuitive things. In a way, is the same thing that we are doing here right now. Like talking about a topic where we are marrying data analytics and data science with fantasy football. There are hundreds of others in the world who are doing really smart things in fairly non-obvious places. For example, like who is probably looking at weather patterns, find trading commodities. A classic example is lentils.
You're a lentil broker now.
I mean, it's so fun to talk about all of these things. And there was somebody else who was having like a drone fleet, almost like a fleet of micro databases to cut down data ingestion cost. And these are the really interesting topics to talk about, right? The obvious ones, there are enough people talking about it. There is enough content around it. There is enough to read about it and enough to be confused about it. It's really the hidden ones that always piques my interest.
So if there's a listener out there that's doing either of those, we want to talk to you. And now let's hear the interview with Josh Lee. All right, welcome, Josh Lee. I think I spoke to you like a year and a half ago about a similar topic. We were talking about data and analytics and fantasy football, and a lot's changed since then. I think you were working at Capital One and doing the Undroppables, but now it seems like you've doubled down or you've just gained a lot more popularity and success in fantasy football. So what exactly are you up to now?
I have since left Capital One. I have moved on to kind of a Capital One-esque startup, Mission Lane. It's a credit card startup focused on the subprime population. That's kind of how Capital One got really big. And it's been a lot of fun. I've been working there for the past 9 months now. The amount of attention and growth that I've seen in the fantasy football space has been incredible. Just the amount of likes, retweets, followers that I've gained over the past year. It's been a ton of fun. The goal is to make that my full-time job.
Yeah, so you are the COO of Pharoah Analytics. You're also head of analytics for sports and content publishing company, the Undroppables, and you also host the Unending Rebuild football podcast. Is that all true? I just don't know how you have time for all that.
I don't know either. I love fantasy football. So like it doesn't feel like a job. It doesn't feel like a chore where like it's just so much fun for me to do all these different things. And I like dedicate like different nights of the week to each of the different jobs that I have to do. It's kind of one of those things where like if you do what you love all the time, like you don't even really think of it as a job. It's more so just like spending time working on a project that you really want to figure out the answer to. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Married to the game, as some say.
Yes, exactly. Love of the game. Love of the game.
And Kaustov, who's the CEO of our company, Paradime, he's brand new to fantasy football. I explained it to him yesterday. I use the example of the stock market. Like you're trying to find the best assets. You know, you invest in some, you buy low, you sell high, you get really sad, you get really happy sometimes. And I kind of Kaustov, like you mentioned, the light sparked and you got a little interested.
Absolutely. I mean, like the parallels between trading in the stock market and finding the hidden gems outside the obvious ones. And that I've always find extremely fascinating. And when Parker started explaining fantasy football to me, I was like, okay, I can understand that. I can get behind that. So yeah, very, very interesting topic.
And I'm used to feeling like the dumb one with Kaustov. He's always explaining stuff to me. So this is like my first experience where I'm teaching Kaustov something and I get to watch him feel like the dumb one. So this is an honor for me, Kaustov.
I am a student here. I am here to learn.
I love it. I love it.
So I have a few big questions that I've prepared. And one of them is, so in fantasy football, there's this division between the nerds and the football purists, right? A football purist would be, you know, that guy you grew up with that played high school football and thinks that he knows everything there is to know about football and fantasy football, I guess. So you, as an analyst, where do you sit? Are you more analytics driven? Or are you more of a football purist, or are you both?
It's kind of funny that you bring that kind of schism up between the two, because like it's definitely very prevalent. It's even prevalent in the NFL. But growing up, I played football for 4 years. Played running back and wide receiver from when I was 6th grade to my freshman year of high school.
Send me your huddle highlights.
I'll have to go digging around for some of those, but I did suffer 3 concussions while playing, so had to hang up the cleats. During high school, I played soccer all 4 years. Play a lot of basketball now, but still love to play like flag football. Actually, this past weekend I was at the Fantasy Football Expo.
I saw that.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. First game, my team was up, scored the opening touchdown of the entire tournament. So it was a ton of fun, absolute blast. Highly recommend both you and Kostov and anybody listening to the show. You should definitely go out to the Fantasy Football Expo next year. It doesn't matter if you are a huge data analytics person, you just love fantasy football, or you're just looking for community. It is just a ton of fun. It's a wonderful experience. Des Bryant was there. He's like the nicest guy ever. Like he
that's awesome.
was taking pictures, like having conversations with anybody that approached him. So he was super, super cool. But kind of back to the original question, am I more of a analytics sort of guy or more of like a football purist? I'd like to say I'm a little bit of both. We all build like general intuition just from watching football, right? So kind of the most beautiful part of it is when you see something and the data agrees exactly with what your intuition is telling you. And kind of that compounding factor is usually where I like to put my chips. I like to put my money behind where I can see something on TV on the football field, and then the data agrees with exactly what I'm thinking. And those are the types of guys that I like to bet on.
That's very interesting, because when I used to work at Goldman or even before that, every time you're looking at trading, you have an understanding of a company, and then you see the data to see that whether that understanding gets bolstered by your thinking about the company. So one of the questions I have is, as an analyst, you probably spend like hours working through models and working through repos to discover an answer that you found in the data. So or when making a big fantasy football decision, how do you decide what should be analyzed versus what you already know instinctively?
That's a very good question. It's a little bit more broad in general, so I'm going to get a little bit more specific. So let's take, I'm going to get like very, very specific from the player perspective. Let's take someone like Derrick Henry, for example. Derrick Henry is a 29-year-old running back who plays for the Tennessee Titans, and he's been a beast his entire career. When you watch him on TV, he looks like a man amongst boys. He's stiff arming these giant NFL linebackers into the ground like they're made of paper. He's an absolute behemoth of a man. When you're looking at the data for running backs, though, from an average perspective, it says as soon as a running back hits the age of 26, 27, their career starts to decline. One of the things that I love about kind of blending what you see on TV and blending the analytics is the importance of adding context to these sorts of situations. When you're watching football, like you can kind of identify certain guys as outliers, guys who are going to break the model per se. So Derrick Henry is one of those guys that not going to follow your typical running back production curve trajectory. And it's funny because the machine learning models that I built were able to identify that. And it has Derrick Henry continuing to score a lot of fantasy points this season. And I'm trying to draft Derrick Henry in every single draft that I'm in.
As a first round, or are you looking at him more second round? That totally depends on the size of your league and all that. But is he like, do you want him number 2 on your roster, number 1 on your roster? What are you looking at?
If I can get him number 2 on my roster, that is phenomenal. If I'm in a room where it feels like someone else might take him before me, I do not hate taking Derrick Henry in the first round, typically the back end of the first round. So if I'm drafting at like the 111, 112, and it's like a 2 running back, 2 wide receiver league, and the top guys are off the board, I like to click on Derrick Henry right there.
And I'm in a couple leagues, but one of my leagues is really competitive. I've been in it for 15 years. So I was like 14 when we started these things. I'm curious, what type of analysis are you performing before a draft? And this can be one of your analyses, or it can be someone else's that you leverage.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're in a home league that you've been in for a long time. One of the beautiful things about being in these home leagues is like you kind of have a good idea of like what your opponents are going to do. So you have an idea of like who they like. And so you can play around with the draft room a little bit that way. But kind of going back to the original question, there's no silver bullet when it comes to one piece of analysis.
Dang it.
There's a lot of different things that you want to blend together so that you can build the most competitive roster. So let me ask you, what is the format of your league? Is it half PPR, full PPR? How many wide receivers do you start?
It's more popular now, but it's full PPR, and we have 2 wide receivers, an offensive player, and 2 quarterbacks.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So from that perspective, you're going to want to draft quarterbacks early, right? So when let's dive into quarterbacks a little bit. When you're drafting quarterbacks, you want to look for rushing upside. Like that is like the number one thing for quarterbacks, because if a quarterback has rushing upside, they're going to have a floor that is much higher than any other quarterback in the league. Because like, let's say guys who don't run a lot, let's say like an Aaron Rodgers, he's not going to get his variance for his weekly scoring output is going to be much greater than that of like a Justin Fields, who does have a lot of rushing production. Because Justin Fields has a floor of like 15 points, just purely based off of the amount of rushing production that he gets. Aaron Rodgers, on the other hand, if he has a really bad game and he doesn't throw any touchdowns, his floor is probably like 5 points. And that's going to really screw you in a given week. So that's why whenever I'm in super flex leagues, or I guess in your case, 2 quarterback leagues, I'm looking for guys that can run. So in the Scott Fish Bowl, if you're not familiar with the Scott Fish Bowl, it's a really large tournament of like 3,000 players, and it's for charity every single year. It's an absolute incredible sort of organization and something that I definitely highly recommend looking into. I was actually at a Scott Fish Bowl live draft this year in DC, and it was a ton of fun. You could really see like the camaraderie, the community amongst everyone. It was such a joy. My 2 quarterbacks are Justin Fields and Daniel Jones. And I took Daniel Jones in the 3rd round of that draft because Daniel Jones has one of the safest floors out of all of the quarterbacks. My models love Daniel Jones because I know there's been like, yeah, exactly, right? It's like public perception kind of skews it where it's like, okay, Daniel Jones is kind of a goofy guy. Reminds you a little bit of like Eli Manning because he wears that Giants blue as well. He's the Giants quarterback. So like he's not like he's not a sexy pick. But Daniel Jones will get you points. Last year he was QB9. His rushing prop on all of the Vegas sportsbook has him finishing 5th in the NFL for quarterbacks for rushing yards. And I'm super excited for him in the second year of Brian Daboll's offense. So he's a guy that I've been drafting a pretty decent amount of.
All right, I'll take Danny Dimes. I'm fine with that. Thanks for the pointer.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's fascinating to hear you kind of having that fluency of thought, and you know literally all the players by heart and what they do and how they play, and it's just incredible. So I mean, like, I'm just wondering, like, let's say, and it's a question I have. If I have to start tomorrow in fantasy football, and I'm already getting excited, right? Where should I start? Should I start from the Undroppables website and look at the scores, or how should I start?
The Undroppables website is a phenomenal resource. So I'd go on the Undroppables website and just start looking at some of our team's rankings. So if you're more interested on like the model side, I do have a few tweets that I can send you, and they kind of walk through like my process of like building the models and what the model determines as the most important variables in terms of predicting the amount of fantasy points that a player is going to score each season. So getting a little bit deeper into the weeds into the model side of house, because that's something that I'm very passionate about, and I think gives me a pretty distinct edge in fantasy football. So I built 4 different models. I built 4 different XG boost models, one for each position, one for quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, just so I can get an understanding of exactly what variables I should be looking for in drafting each of those positions. So let's take quarterback, for example. The one thing that popped, rushing production, like I talked about when I was giving Parker the advice to draft Daniel Jones. For running back, the thing that popped the most, there were 2 things actually. The first was rushing EPA. So EPA stands for expected points added. So expected points added are calculated in terms of when the running back gets the ball, how many expected points do they add to the team score in terms of touchdowns? So touchdown is a big driving factor for EPA, and first downs, because if you get your team a first down, the drive extends and you have a higher likelihood of scoring a touchdown or getting a field goal, thus expected points. So rushing EPA and then receiving yards per game was a very predictive metric. So when running backs, when they catch the ball as well as run the ball, they are some of the most valuable players in fantasy football, because essentially they are both a running back and a wide receiver combined. Take Christian McCaffrey, for example. Christian McCaffrey back in 2019 had 110 receptions. If Christian McCaffrey had 0 rushing production and only his receiving stats, he would have still finished in the top 10 for fantasy points. But you take his receiving production and you add in all of his rushing production as well, he was the most cheat code broken fantasy player of
it was
all
awesome.
time.
I had
It was
great.
incredible. He guaranteed like you to win the championship that season. It was unreal what he could do. So that's what I'll say about running backs. For receivers, it's pretty self-explanatory. Actually, my receiving model was my best one by far. It was able to predict the expected fantasy points per game within 2 points, and the
Wow.
R squared for that was 60%. So it's able to explain 60% of the variance in the data just off of the inputs that I fed it, which I thought was pretty incredible, because like there are so many different things that go into fantasy points that I was amazed that it was able to predict it at a 60% rate. And then for tight ends was actually in my opinion, worst model. The R square was at a pretty low 32%. And I think that speaks to the tight end position itself, because the tight end position is so touchdown dependent. Basically, if your tight end scores touchdowns, then they are going to score more points. So that ties into the strength of the offense as a whole. And that's why this offseason, I actually built another model to predict the amount of touchdowns that each team is going to score. I haven't released that model. That's actually part of my work with Pharoah Analytics. And that's kind of the driving factor behind us starting this company, because we've done all this work and it's going to be pretty value, I think. And we're trying to sell API licenses to a lot of different sports books, betting companies, content companies. There's a lot of opportunity in the fantasy sports and gaming space. So I'm excited for what's to come.
Yeah, I'm stoked for you, man. Like you're in the perfect industry at the perfect time, and you have all this experience. So I'm excited to keep watching. This is exciting. I'm curious, in that tight end model, have you found anything interesting about Brian Keithy?
Who?
Oh wait, not Keith. Oh, who's the Bills guy? The new Bills tight end. I just forgot his name.
Dalton Kincaid.
Dalton Kincaid. That's it. What have you found interesting about him?
Dalton Kincaid is one of my favorite players this season. Yeah, I love Dalton Kincaid. He's essentially a wide receiver in the tight end position. He's the type of profile that I like to chase in the tight end position, because if you can get receiving production out of someone in your tight end spot, that gives you such an advantage over the field. Take Travis Kelce, for example. Travis Kelce earns the most targets out of anyone on the Kansas City Chiefs roster. Kansas City Chiefs have a phenomenal offense. He's going to score a lot of points. Dalton Kincaid, while he doesn't have the upside to be the number one target earner on the Bills offense because Stephon Diggs is there, I think he is. I have him slotted in for 100 targets this season, just based off of the amount of passing volume that the Bills typically have and the strength of their quarterback in Josh Allen. I'm very excited for Dalton Kincaid. I think he's going to be the third option in that Bills offense. They've kind of been searching for that third guy for a long time. Isaiah McKenzie couldn't do it for them last season, and there was a lot of buzz around Dalton Kincaid going into the draft, and the Bills actually ended up trading up to go ahead and draft Dalton Kincaid in the first round. So I'm very excited to see what he can do this year.
What I was like really getting fascinated by is you have all of these models running and constantly running them. What's like your data stack look like? What do you use to keep the lights on to make sure that all the predictions come out at the right time?
Yeah, kind of the beautiful thing about this is all like preseason, so I don't have to worry about real-time information, real-time data, anything like that. I only worry about getting all of my data from the previous seasons. Actually, my historical data set goes back to 2003, and I'm able to analyze all of that data to predict this coming season's fantasy points. And because fantasy football drafts, they all happen before the NFL season starts, so I just have to make sure that I have my models ready by the time I enter my drafts. And kind of the big thing behind me spending so much, I probably spent about 2.5 months building my models, and it was all based off of me trying to win this one fantasy football tournament called Best Ball Mania. Best Ball Mania is a tournament hosted by Underdog Fantasy. It is a tournament of 680,000 different teams, and first place of the tournament wins $3 million. And every
game on.
entry, yeah, game on, exactly. Every single entry, every draft costs $25. So my upside is I can win $3 million on just a $25 investment.
So to follow up on that, I mean, on the Undroppables website, you were using XGBoost as the underlying technology or the models or, for most of your predictions. Why XGBoost? Do you sort of combine random forest with XGBoost? Have you tried like Cat Boost and then that didn't work? So what was some of the things that you tried and it was like, oh, that's not really worth my time?
So I'm not gonna lie, I don't come from a data science background. I'm a stat and econ major, and I had done a bunch of research on what's the best algorithms to use for predictive analysis. And a lot of the things that won like these Kaggle competitions, these data science competitions was XGBoost. I had done some very initial base model building with just simple regression analysis, logistic regression too, but the results weren't nearly as strong as I wanted them to be. And then the second I plugged in XGBoost, the results skyrocketed, and I was like, oh yeah, this is the one.
Gotcha. I think your skill comes into how you build your features, right? What you feed into these models, because that's where the garbage in, garbage out problem happens, right?
That is right.
And the last question before we let you go, I'm really interested in this one. So in that XGBoost model that you, well, I think it's actually the Undroppables risk score model that you created. You fed it all these data sources. You had historical fantasy football data, you had weather data, you had a ton of other stuff. And it says that the real variable that mattered was just historic performance. And that seems so obvious. When you learned that, like, is that what you expected, or were you kind of surprised?
I mean, it was what I expected, but like I wasn't expecting it to be that simple at the same time. Intuitively, like, yes, that it should be what we're all looking for, but because there's so much data that's out there now, it's like, oh, maybe this is important, maybe this is important, maybe this is important. Like, so many different analysts are talking about so many different things now that you kind of lose sight of what's truly important. And what's truly important, it's how they performed in previous seasons. So it was a nice, like, little refresher, kind of like take a step back and you realize that, like, all that other stuff doesn't really matter. The only thing that you should really be looking at is how they performed in previous seasons.
Yeah, Occam's razor still stands true. The simple answer is the right one.
Exactly.
That's the signal in the noise.
Yeah, great. That's all the questions I have. Kalsaf, is there anything else you'd like to add before we let Josh go?
I think this was a very fascinating conversation, and I learned so much from you, Josh. Now I'm probably be checking out a few websites to kind of geek out and nerd out on fantasy football now. So yeah, thanks for making the time for us.
Josh, where's the best place for people to reach you, or which website? I'll include your Twitter. And where else should people find you?
Yeah, Twitter is definitely the best spot to find me for all things fantasy football. Everyone can find me at Joshua J Gunn on Twitter. J Gunn spelled JAEHYUN. Outside of that, you guys should start to follow along at Pharoah Analytics, PharoahAnalytics.com. We're building something pretty cool over there. So I'm excited to see what the future holds for us.
I will. Josh, thank you so much. That was awesome. I'm excited for more Twitter content, more help on my teams.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks, Josh.
See ya. So how awesome was that? I had so much fun hearing from Josh.
I mean, like I was totally blown away by the depth of his knowledge. I mean, like being able to call player by player and what they've done in 2019 onwards, and being able to have that command over so many players, so many teams, so many variables is truly impressive.
Yeah, and the best analysts or data scientists are always the one that have the technical expertise and the domain expertise. So like they might be experts in marketing and they might be experts in data science. And that's exactly what Josh is for fantasy football.
100%, 100%. I've seen so many times like a data scientist or a data analyst come into a job and then they're like completely clueless because they cannot differentiate the signal from the noise. They do not spend time in the domain, understanding the domain where they're operating. As a result, they're never able to be successful because they just don't know what they're operating. If you're working in a revenue team, you got to understand how the company makes money, right? If you're in a product team, you got to understand what product metrics the product teams care about and what does the product do, how the users interact with the product. If you do not have that understanding, you will never be able to separate the signal from the noise. Same here, like so many different parameters, so many different things. And once you kind of know that, hey, what matters is the player's performance in the previous season, you've separated so much noise that you can focus on what really matters.
Yeah, and my biggest takeaway was when he was talking about this guy, Daniel Jones. You may not have heard of him, but he's this very, if you watched a game of his, you'd think, oh, he's an average fantasy scorer. But according to Josh in the analysis he ran, he's a top 10 quarterback. And that's really interesting that he found that golden nugget. And I have a draft coming up, and I'm for sure going to be drafting Daniel Jones. So I got some value out of that.
You got some value out of that. I think with a lot of these underrated players or the underdogs, it's like when you analyze their performance across games, what you see is a very different metric compared to when you just look at their performance on a per game basis. And all of a sudden, everything starts to look very different. It's like, okay, this guy is probably really good in certain situations, and he's a consistent performer in other situations, which kind of makes him a very valuable player to have in the team because he's dependable and he performs consistently.
Absolutely. And to wrap up, what was the main takeaway that you got out of that whole conversation?
So my main takeaway is that to be effective in data analysis, you have to separate the signal from the noise. And to be able to do that, you need domain knowledge.
Amen. I can agree with that. That's all for this episode of Somewhat Analytics. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And we will see you next week.
Awesome.
See you, Kowstow.
Cheers.